Welcome once again to the complete free Flutter course presented by yours truly, Ovidus Mazurum. So in the last few videos we spoke about a few different state management solutions. Specifically we went over provider, getX, and also we spoke about stateful versus stateless widgets. In this video we're going to take a look at the OG of state management, the original creator as it were, and that is Redux. For anybody that has worked with React or React Native, Redux should be familiar to you guys, but it is going to be a little bit different in Flutter than what you'd see in the JavaScript world. And the reason for this is because we are going to take advantage of things like provider to rebuild things for us automatically. But of course, there's a package which does that for us. We don't need to do that manually. So that's going to be great. But first, let's take a really quick look at Redux. So Redux is one of the original state management solutions. And the reason it came about, and I think I have a couple pictures here, this shows the flow of data, the flow of information in Redux. And notice here it says view. Now, for those of you that don't know, a view is kind of like a screen in Flutter. Normally we call them screens instead, or you could think of it as a page, anything like that. Because traditionally, when Redux came about, people were using the MVC architecture a lot, model view controller. And the guys over at Facebook run into a problem because they had a lot of different models, a lot of different views, a lot of different controllers, and the views were all trying to communicate with each other, and there were just a whole bunch of different pages trying to control the same thing, and that was leading to all kinds of problems. You know, they were trying to control different things, and then that information was being sent back and forth, and it just wasn't working well. It's kind of like what I showed you guys in the original Why Do We Need state management video, but it was a much bigger scale because this is Facebook rather than a small app that I made myself. And this led to all kinds of problems, and specifically there was a bug where Messenger always told you you had a notification, a message, even though you didn't. And the guys over at Facebook just couldn't track it down because there were too many different pages, too many views which were trying to communicate with that same component at the same time. So trying to figure out where that mistake was coming from was just impossible. So what they ended up doing was creating a unidirectional data flow. So the store which they make it's really similar to the things we've worked with before, but one thing they have which we might not have worked with is this unidirectional data flow. So what that means is that, well, the data flows in a single direction. There's no back and forth communication. In fact, what they did was they had the views, or we'll call them screens, communicate with the store, which we can also call the state, via actions. And actions, you can think of them as events. The view would do something and it would call some kind of action or some kind of event, which could hold some kind of payload, that's any kind of data. And then this action would be dispatched. A dispatch was just something which kind of queues up events. And then that dispatched action would go into reducer. The reducer then decides how to modify the state in accordance with the action or the event. And this can go around in a loop a few times, or it can just go through the states. And once we have our new state, so our reducer will take the old state and it takes the action. And from that, it results in a new state. And once we have that new state is sent back to the view or to the screen. So the view receives a state, it shows whatever we want to see because of the state, but it doesn't have direct control over the state. Instead, it works only with actions. So in this way, it can be a tiny bit different than getX and provider, because getX and provider is not that strict over what we can and can't do. I could change some kind of variable just myself with getX, but in Redux I'm not allowed to do that. In Redux I need to pass along that event. And by the way, the same architecture is going to be very similar with what we're going to see in the future, which is BLoC. BLoC is actually one of my favorite patterns. It's one which any Flutter developer absolutely needs to know. If you don't know how to, make a block, then what are you even doing? You can't be a complete Flutter developer yet. So we'll definitely look at that in the future. But yeah, we're going to look at Redux first. And there is one more part to this, which we're actually going to go over in the next video rather than this, which is here, middleware. So this again shows the single directional data flow, but this one has an extra components middleware. I'm not going to go too much into what that is this time, but essentially it's just something we can put in between the actions of the reducer to do different things. It can kind of hijack the flow of data to kind of inject some kind of logic or do something based on whatever condition. And it'll make sense why we do this in a bit. In fact, let's go ahead and look at the 3 principles of Redux. So the first one is a single source of truth. One of the reasons we make these Redux stores is because we want the state of the whole application to be stored in an object tree within a single store. So I'm curious what you guys think when you hear this. Do you guys think this is the same as provider? Is it the same as getX? Is it something which we would do in, with other libraries? So this one, maybe not. Because, so Redux itself says there should be a single store, but actually the original solution to the thing I mentioned was Flux. Redux is based on Flux, and one of the big differences between Redux and Flux as state management is that Flux doesn't necessarily need a single store. So in our previous app, we had provider for the stopwatch and getX for the timer, and that's, it's perfectly fine. A lot of people do it that way. Most of my apps would have different stores for different situations, but Redux doesn't let us do that. In Redux, I have to have a single store for the entire app. And again, this happened because Facebook was just having a lot of issues with not knowing where the data was coming from. So they wanted to control everything to make sure they could really see exactly what was happening. But if we're not at Facebook scale, I think it's fine if we have multiple stores. Next is the state is read-only. So this is important. The only way to change the state is to emit an action, an object describing what happened. So that's exactly what I was talking about. We need to change the state via these actions, or we can also call them events. So we don't access the data in the store directly. We don't access the reducer directly. And what do you guys think? Is this the same or is it different than getX, the provider? This one is different because in provider and in getX, I can modify that directly, which is absolutely not at all allowed in Redux. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I prefer BLoC. BLoC works in the same way. And the final one, changes are made with pure functions. So pure functions are not something we spoke about previously. A pure function basically means that there are no side effects. For any one input that goes in, there must always be one single output that comes out. So for example, if we take a function add x plus 1, this is pure because for any number I put in, I'm always going to get the same answer. But on the other hand, if I have something which, for example, takes down the time, takes down the date, and then does something in accordance with that, it's no longer a pure function because I can get different outputs depending on that time, depending on these other factors, and I could look at different things. This is exactly what this middleware is for, because the reducer must be pure. For every one input that goes in, one input comes out, regardless of anything else, regardless of whatever's in the store or anything like that. The middleware is that extra injection which lets us add a bit of extra logic. The middleware lets us say, okay, well, if the time is this, we can do this. If the time is something else, we can do this other thing. So that's what allows us to keep a pure function for the reducer, but at the same time have those different variables. And they say it right here. So to specify how the state tree is transformed by actions, you write pure reducers. And of course, the reducers take the previous state and an action and return the next state. So our middleware could be inserted between this, and our middleware could give different actions along with the previous state to get the next state. So one thing our middleware could do, for example, is I could pass along that time or date as a separate action or as a separate payload in the action. And by doing that, the reducer stays a pure reducer, even though I'm able to access that data, whatever data I want, elsewhere. Okay, so that is it for this. Let's actually jump into the app. And I think, I'm not sure why I have this, I'm in the isolate printing. I created a new project, but it seems to have copied along my code from last time. But yeah, I'm just gonna leave that for now. So I just created an empty project, and this is just the counter app, the default. What we're going to do in this project is we're gonna make a quick conversion app. And so in this first video, we're gonna have just kilometers to miles, but in the next video, when we introduce middleware, we'll look at different conversions and we'll just make the app a whole lot better and more complex. But for now, let's go to main.dart, and you can see this is entirely unmodified. I'm going to hit Control F to find everything, --dot star, and select this button here to use regular expressions. What this does is it selects any line that starts with the double dash. I'm going to put 2 spaces and hit enter and replace all. Control-Shift-I is going to get rid of all of that extra space. I'm going to make this a bit smaller. And I'm going to leave my app for now. First, we're going to make the really quick UI before jumping into the Redux stuff. I'm going to change this just to home. And although this is a quick, call it home screen instead. Although this is just a quick app, I do still want to separate my widgets. So I'm going to have screens here. And I'm going to make a home screen.dart, which has IMPM, the material, STF, STL, stateless, home screen. That. So now I can import this, and this does not need to take anything currently, and this is going to return scaffold. Sorry, my num lock was on. I don't need any app bar, but I'm going to give it a body, which is going to be a column. The column, of course, takes children. And the first is going to be a text which has just KM. Then I'm going to have a padding of const edge and set dot all. Let's give it 20. And the child is going to be, first I want to format this for myself. The child is going to be a text form field. So in the past we worked with text fields. A text form field is just a wrapper around the text field. When we use text form field, we don't need to work with that text editing controller directly. It kind of automates some things for us, so it can make it a bit easier. It can also make it more frustrating to do something if you want to have manual control over whatever you're modifying. That's why last time I used a text editing controller, but in this case, it's not going to get in our way, so we can use this. And this has a lot of different properties. We're not going to look at all of them. What I am going to use is, I think there's a decoration, yeah. And I forget what this takes. It takes an input decoration. And this has a whole bunch of things. I'm going to give it a label text of KM, and I can't remember if this is a string or a widget. It's a string, so that's fine. And I think that's the only thing I'm going to give it for now. let's actually see what I've made already, because I haven't saved this. Yeah. So right now, the only thing we see, and I should really wrap this in a safe area. We see kilometers here, and we can make that look nicer afterwards. Then we see that label text in here. If I click on here, I can now write whatever I want to write. And I'm not going to worry too much about the way it looks. That's not what this video is focused on. One thing I did want to change, however, was the keyboard type. I want a text input type dot number. What this is going to do is when I click, I'm going to have to do a hard refresh. When I click here, it's going to bring up that number keyboard, because of course I want this to be a number. And that's going to be it for now here. I am going to give an onChanged of an empty function. We're going to, yeah, that should take a value. We're going to change this once we have our store. This is going to end up emitting an action, but we're not quite there yet. Okay, so now that I have that, I'm going to have another text which says miles. And then here, I'm going to give it another padding, the same as the previous one, of const edgeInsets.all 20. And this will just have a child of a text of an empty string. And in the future, I'm going to change this to be whatever value I get from my miles. But again, I need my store before I can do that. And finally, I'm going to make a raised button. And what my raised button is going to do, so that's on pressed, is for now it's just going to be an empty function, but in the future this is going to emit an action which will actually make me change, make that conversion. And my child is going to be a text which just says convert, like that. So if I refresh it, now we can see our button. It does not look good, but that's fine. I'm going to leave it. One thing I do want to do is give it a main axis alignment of main axis alignment dot space between, space around, just so they're not so grouped up like they were before. What's the last one? Space evenly. Yeah, so I'm going to use space evenly. I think that's fine. That's the best I have. Okay, so this is the UI we're going to work with in this video. I know it's really simple, but again, that's not what the focus of this video is. So we're going to leave that for now. Now we're going to make the actual store. So we're going to right click on lib, new folder, and I'm going to make a Redux folder. You can also make a, you can make your folder called state or store, whatever you want. I personally always use Redux when it's Redux, but other people do it other ways. And I'm going to make a new file here called actions.dart. In fact, before this, let's make our store.dart. So the store.dart, I could also call it state.dart, is just holding the actual state. And keep in mind what I mentioned previously, that Redux is perhaps the oldest state management solution we have. The one in Flutter has been updated and modified to work with some of the Flutter specific features, but because it is based on the JavaScript one, it uses less advanced stuff initially, at least in this part. So we're just going to create a basic class, and I'm going to call it store. We can call it app state or anything we want. In fact, I'll call it app state. And now let's think about what information we actually need in the state. So I need something in the kilometers, something to hold the miles. So I'm going to say string km, string miles. You might be wondering why I'm using strings rather than ints or doubles. Reason is because when we actually get this data, it is a string. When I output it, it is a string. And of course I need to convert between the two, but it's not something I want to worry about right now. And let's make a constructor for this. So actually both of these should be final. I am not going to make these required. I'm going to leave them like that. One more thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a copy with function here. And copy with is going to take km and miles. That's string. And it's also going to take app state, or prev state. Prev is fine. For anybody that doesn't remember, when we do this, we have the class name dot and then some kind of, whatever name. We're creating another constructor. We're creating another way to make a new instance of whatever object we're creating. So in this case, what I'm doing is this copy with method will take a previous state, and if we pass in this information, then we're gonna use it. But if we don't get this new information, we're gonna use whatever was here previously. So I'm gonna say this.km equals, and I'll set it equal to prev.km or km. And this.miles equals prev.miles or miles. Maybe I can't have the final here. Yeah, because I'm changing it in the in this other constructor. If you guys haven't seen this double question mark before, it's similar to, so before we used question equals, which said if null, make it equal to whatever. This is similar, but we're not setting the previous thing equal to it. Because if I say prev km question mark equals, and this should actually be the other way around, by the way, I just noticed. Km prev.km miles prev.miles. So if I had, and let's just fix it here as well. If I had it like this, I would set kilometers equal to the previous kilometers, which then I'd be setting equal to this.km, which I mean is fine. But in this case, by using question mark, I'm saying if this value is null, use this value instead. But if this value is not null, then just use this value. And then we don't need to look at prev.km. So yeah, overall what this is going to do is if we pass in kilometers, if we pass in miles, it's going to use those to make the new states. But if we don't pass in those two values, it's just going to use whatever I get from the previous state. And as a result, I am going to need to pass in the previous app states. So you guys can see, I think I still have this open. And it doesn't actually write it here. One more thing about Redux is that the state must be immutable. The state cannot change. Whenever we want to change something in the state, what we have to do is fully destroy the old state and emit a new state instead. So that way everything gets reconstructed and we know we have the most up-to-date information. It's the same as what we saw with Uninherited widget, if you guys remember when we made that. We do not actually update it, we destroy the old one, create a new one to replace it. So that is exactly why I'm passing in the previous state and doing all of that. But okay, so that's my store. And notice I'm not extending anything. I don't need to do that because, again, it's kind of an older thing, older state management solution, so there's no need. And now I need to look at the actions. So what are the different events which can trigger my store to change or to rebuild? Well, I have a button here, convert. So obviously I need some kind of class convert. And this is actually perfectly fine. this is my entire class. But if I wanted to make it a bit more, you know, complicated or whatever, I can make an abstract class action, and then I could make my class convert extends action, and my action doesn't do anything. The only reason I created it is for polymorphism, and my convert also does not actually do anything. It's just that event I pass in. In JavaScript, what you'll often see is the action is just going to be a string, but by making it into a class, I have more type safety. So this is a better way of doing it. And my convert does not need any payload. It doesn't need any data because I'm going to get this from the store in other places. But there is one more action I need, which is going to be class update km extends action. And this one does need that payload. Payload is just what we call the data by convention in Redux, but I could really call it anything I want because we're not using JavaScript right now. And the update km is going to take a string. I'm just going to call it payload. And then we can just make the constructor like this. So we can see our actions are very light objects. Convert is a single class with nothing. Update km simply has that payload, and that payload will be the new kilometers. So there's really not much here because, well, the whole thing is kind of a system. So to make it work, we also need our reducers dot. And what our reducers is going to do, our reducer is going to take our previous state or store. It's going to take an action and it's going to give us a new state as a result. So our reducer or reducers is a function, and it's going to return an app state, and it's going to take an app state, prev state, and it's going to take an action. And we need to import, where's the correct one? I also need my actions and my store. And the first thing I'm going to do is make an app state, new state, like that. And then I'm going to say if action is, and we can get the names from here, update km, what we're going to do is say, first let's actually print what's happening so we can see exactly what's going on. And we're doing this in case we have any errors, but I don't suspect we will. So the action is should just say update km, action.payload should be whatever updated km, whatever value we want to update. And then we're going to set new state equal to app state dot copy with prev is going to be my prev state, and my km is going to be my action dot payload. So this does exactly what you guys think it does. It takes my previous state, copies everything from there, and then it's gonna update just the kilometers because that's exactly what the action is. Else, if action is convert, then we're gonna have to do other things. And again, I'm just gonna print the action. And in fact, one thing I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna print the new state and print new state dot km, just so we can see exactly what's happening. And now I'm going to do something a little bit dodgy. I would remind you guys, of course, that reducers must be pure functions, and my reducer is going to be a pure function, but it's not going to be super strict. Many people, and myself included actually, normally when we make reducers, they literally just do something like this. they're literally just one, maybe two lines, which takes the previous state, copies it with the previous state and the new payload, and that's it, right? But because I don't want to overcomplicate this video with middleware, I'm going to do something which should go into the middleware, and I'm just going to write it here. The following code belongs in middleware, not in reducers. So don't do this. We're just trying to simplify this video. And what we're going to do here is simplify, just convert from our kilometers to our miles. So I'm going to take double km, let's say km as double equals double dot pass, and we're going to pass prev state dot km. And keep in mind that I don't have any error checking here. This is exactly why it belongs in the middleware, because this could throw an error, so it's no longer a pure function. It depends on what is in here. It could mess up, but again, I'm going to leave that for now. So I have that, and then I'm going to say double miles as double equals km as double times Google how many km in a mile. And I actually meant it the other way around. How many miles in a km. Here. So our miles is just going to be our kilometers times this value, which Google has given me. And I'll just print miles as double so we can see exactly what's happening. And then my new state is going to equal app state dot copy with, prev is the prev state, and miles is going to be miles as double dot toString. And of course, the reason I'm doing a toString is because here it's a double. I could also format this a bit nicer. For now, I'm not going to, but it's up to you if you want to or not. Okay, so in both these cases, we've updated, I'll just add a couple enters so we can see more clearly. We've updated the new state. So now the only thing we need to do is return our new state like that. Okay, so let's do a really quick review because our Redux store is pretty much finished. Now we just need to connect it to our app. And the way we do that is going to be very, very different from Flutter and JavaScript. But let's quickly look at what we've done. So our store has three parts. It has the store itself, or the state, which holds whatever information we need. For our particular case, right now, we only have kilometers and miles. Obviously, we'd have a lot more options if we were a bigger app. And we are going to add a few more in the next video. This just holds the data. It holds the data and nothing else. And then we also gave it a copy with function to make or constructor to make a new object from the previous state, along with additional data we can pass in, but do not have to pass in. Then we created actions. These actions are simply events. They tell us how we want to modify our state. And those actions are passed to our reducer or reducers along with the previous state. And then our previous state will, our reducers will update our state using that copy with constructor from the previous state and whatever payload, whatever data is in the action. So all we're doing is we're listening for the type of action and then updating the correct payload as a response. So if we're updating kilometers, we're updating kilometers. If the action is convert, we are updating the miles and leaving the kilometers as it was. We're not modifying that. And finally, we're returning a new state. We're not changing the previous state. We are creating an entirely new state, and that's really important. We cannot have mutability in Redux. It's not allowed, ever. Okay, but that is actually it for the Redux. Now we just need to actually connect this to our home screen. The way that we're going to connect our Redux store to our Flutter project is going to be very, very different between JavaScript, React, and Flutter. So if you're somebody from React Native who so far has been following along thinking, oh yeah, that's super easy, I do things exactly the same way or almost the same way, you no longer do. So we're going to take advantage of Provider behind the scenes to connect everything for us. But before we do that, I just realized I have not added our packages. So I went to my pubspec.yaml, pubspec assist, add update dependency, and I want Redux. I'm just going to take the first one, Redux, and again, Flutter Redux. I'm going to save it. As you guys can guess, my Flutter Redux is going to give me access to my specific provider for my app state. And the first thing I'm going to do is go into my main function, because I need to create an initial state, which actually I could have also done in the store. I could have had another constructor here called appstate.initial. In fact, why don't I do that? Appstate.initial, and this is going to take nothing. And this is going to make this .km equals 0. Keep in mind km is a string, so we do need the open and closing braces around it. This .miles, going to set this to 0 as well. Okay, that's fine. But we don't necessarily need to do that. I could have also just created it the old-fashioned way. So now I'm going to have a store, which I'm going to get from, which I am going to restart my VS Code to get access to those packages I just imported. Okay, so I've just restarted my VS Code, so I get access to those packages I just imported. I really love VS Code, but the one thing I absolutely hate is that whenever I add things to my pubspec.yaml, I don't know if it's like this for you guys as well, but for myself, whenever I add things to my pubspec.yaml, I always need to restart VS Code, because if I don't, it doesn't see those imports. I can't import anything until I actually restart it, which is not my favorite thing in the entire world, but that's fine. Okay, so now I can import it from Redux. So this is just from the original Redux. And store is going to take a generic type of whatever store or state we have created. For ourselves, it's going to be the one we created here, which is app state, like this. So this you should recognize quite similar to provider or getX or things like that. So store app state, and I'm going to call it store equals store app state. And what this is going to take, so this is going to create a new store. It's going to take our reducers, the function itself, so I don't need to pass in the variables. And then it's also going to take in an initial state, which of course I just created like that. And this should be specified as initial state, like that. And so this is giving me an error because it wants the reducer to be a function of type appState dynamic, whereas I made an appState action. So, you know, I was trying to be a bit clever, and because you guys know I hate using dynamic. But okay, now they want me to use dynamic, so by updating that, it's gonna work like this. That's fine. And now I need my app to take store, which means I need to pass it in here. So this is gonna take store. So this is gonna take a final store, and then we're gonna need to create the constructor. And we're going to wrap our material app in a widget, and the widget we're going to use is going to be store provider, and this is going to take a type of whatever state we're giving it, in this case app state. So we're going to import this from Flutter Redux, and in addition to the child, it also takes a store property which is the store that we just created here and passed in here. So that's fine. And again, so this provider, it's a wrapper around the provider which we used previously. So that is fine. And we're done with this main page. We've now connected all of this. Now we need to connect our home screen. So the same way with provider, we needed to use that consumer to get the data. Now we need to do a similar thing here. And we need that both for the actions and for to listen to the variables themselves. And we could either wrap the individual, like exactly where we need it, which would be the text form field, and then the raise button and the text here. But instead, I'm just going to wrap the entire scaffold, entire column. Let's wrap the entire column. And the widget we're wrapping it in is going to be a store connector. And store connector is going to take app state. So I need to import this and import this, fix the imports. So this takes what value we're listening to and what value we're emitting. For us, we just use the actual app state in both versions. If you made something like the counter app, which is always a popular example, you might not be emitting the entire state. You might instead just be accepting an int or emitting an int or something like that. But for us, and I think most of the apps you're going to be using, we're just going to be using the entire state for both of these. And this does not take a child. It does, however, take a store, which will be a function store. And it should have been converter, not store. And this gives me my store.state. And then instead of a child, I'm going to have a builder here. My builder is going to take context because everything takes a context really. And then the state which I got from here. And then that's going to result in whatever I'm building. So this is really similar to the provider consumer that you guys have seen before. And now that we have the state, I can now use it here. So let's first look at our onChange. So this is the text form field, which is controlling the kilometers. So we take a value here. What we're going to do is say store provider.of app state context dot, and now we're going to learn a new verb, which is dispatch. Dispatch is like, it's like emit, and dispatch is going to take some kind of action. In this case, we're going to pass in update km, and update km is going to take the value we get from here onChanged. And I'm just going to import this, fix my imports, and I'm gonna make this an arrow function just because I think it's gonna look better, which means I have an extra thing here. I have an extra thing somewhere here. And apparently I made this a named parameter when I really wanted it to be positional because there's only one thing I can pass in. So using this dispatch, that's how I actually emit the event or action. So store provider of app state context dot dispatch update km. And I'm going to use a very similar thing over here in my raise button. So my onPressed, all I'm going to do is say store provider dot of app state context dot dispatch, and we're gonna just pass in convert. My convert action does not need any parameters. Yeah, it's just going to do that by itself. And then finally in miles, what we can do, and this is where we actually want to get that value, is listen to the state here. So state dot miles. And this is giving me an error because I forgot to wrap this in a text. And there we go. So I'm going to need to use Flutter run again. It got cancelled out when I restarted VS Code, but that should be the app. I wouldn't be surprised if I have a couple bugs, but we'll work through those together, no worries. Okay, so I've just restarted everything, and let's see how it works. So if I give it a number like 12, and we can see over here, instance of update.km, so it got the correct one, and it also has the results, and this was the payload 1, payload, and then payload 12. So that seems to be working. And if I hit convert, it has converted it. So this works. I can get rid of this and type in 10, convert, and it does work the way we want it to. Let's try this. And yeah, it seems to be working. Okay, gentlemen, so there we have it. That was basically it for Redux. It's another state management solution which might be a bit more complicated than what we've worked with previously. However, it does actually have a lot of advantages when it comes to debugging, having a more clear data flow. I know that as a beginner, you guys are probably looking at this and thinking, why would I ever use this when I have getX? Especially getX. getX is so simple to use compared to especially something like this. And you will probably see the same thing when we work with BLoC. But getX is not going to be as easy for debugging. It's not going to be as easy for testing. You can see here, because we have much more manual control over our actions, over our reducers, over our store, we can more clearly reason out what's happening. And for you as a developer to fully understand what's happening is very, very important, because that's what's going to lead to a bug-free code. We can see exactly what is modifying what, and that's how we can get to a well-working app. But before we finish, let's do a really quick review. So Redux has 3 parts which are essential. It's the store, which is the actual state. This is going to hold our data, in this case kilometers and miles. I created a couple extra constructors. You don't need to. I think copy with is pretty much essential. You should be using this copy with function. We use this question mark notation to say, if I've passed in the kilometers, use that, but if I haven't passed it in, use whatever is in my previous state. Similarly, we created an initial to just give us those initial values. Then we have our actions. Our actions are the events which we are listening to, and they will hold some kind of data, which by convention is called payload. You could call it whatever you want. And this is what we are reacting to, what we're actually changing. And this could either have a payload or something like convert has no payload. Finally, we have our reducers. And again, don't do this. In the next video, I'm going to clean this up. Don't worry about it. But traditionally, what we would do is, obviously we want to have these print statements. This was just so we could do error checking. All this is going to do is create a new state. It's going to listen to the different types of actions and just create that new state from the previous state and whatever payload we've passed in from our action. And literally, that's all it does. So imagine all of this was gone, because this would be handled by our middleware. And again, this is all it would be, just one line. And that is our reducer. It just gives us a new state because of the previous state and an action. So that's Redux itself. Then to connect it for Flutter, it's going to be a tiny bit different than React. The first thing we're going to do is actually make a store instance using the generic of whatever state we're listening to. And we're going to pass in our reducer or reducers, and then we're going to give it an initial starting state. Then we're going to put that into our root widget, our main or home, whatever. We're going to listen to a store provider, and this of course is specific to Flutter. It's very similar to the change notify provider. You will probably recognize this. This again has the generic app states. We're going to pass in that store over here, and that's it for the store provider. Then when we actually need to do something with it, we're going to use a store connector, which is very, very similar to the consumer, which we used with provider. The store connector is going to use a converter, which is going to pull out the state we're listening to, and then we're going to have a builder which takes our context and our state to give us access to whatever we need to access like this. We can listen to the values using state dot and then whatever property we had in the store. And finally, to actually dispatch the action, we're going to use store provider dot of the type app state context dot dispatch and then the name of the action we created in actions with the payload or no payload like we do here. This one does not have a payload. So it's not terribly complicated. It is quite a lot of boilerplate. It might seem a bit complex at the beginning, but I guarantee you once you get it, it's super simple, and yeah, it's actually really good state management. In the next video, we're going to expand on this. We're going to make it a larger app. We're going to give different kind of properties we can convert between. And in so doing, we're going to learn a bit about middleware, which is going to round off our Redux app. And then after that, we're going to look at my personal favorite state management solution, which is BLoC. It's quite similar to Redux, but I think a bit easier and nicer to use. So that's going to be great. And then we're going to move on to the next module. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you guys are as well. In the meantime, myself, Avidius, I'm out.